No matter what you're doing, no matter who you work for, there is a sense that you have to communicate the value of what you're doing in a way that's going to be received and understood by the people that you're trying to communicate that to.
Hey everyone, my name is Kyle Walgren. Yes, this is another episode of The Business of Education. Today, my guest is Seth Fleischauer. He is the CEO or president and founder of Banyan Global Learning. Since 2008, they've been helping schools use technology to improve wellness around or to students across 3 different continents. They've reached over 10,000 students. Seth, welcome to the show.
Kyle, thanks so much for having me. I wanted to add a stat to that list. We recently tabulated the total number of teaching periods that we have taught over the last 16 years over live video. So that's like one teacher to one whole classroom full of students based on a school site. It's over 40,000, which was a really cool number for us to come across. It's a whole lot of learning.
Before, it is a lot of learning, and congratulations on that. Before
Thank you.
COVID, I think that if you would have gave somebody a stat like that, they would have thought you're crazy. Now,
Yeah.
since, being however many years removed from that, it's probably somebody doesn't think that the idea is crazy to teach over video. But what got you into this? Why'd you want to go this route? What made you start Banyan? Take us on that journey.
Yeah. Well, first, you mentioned the pandemic. Yeah, it's been a wild time to be in distance learning. A whole lot of things have been sort of turned upside down. And one of the things, so I have a podcast called Why Distance Learning. And
Mm-hmm.
the purpose of that podcast is that we all experience something called emergency learning, but everybody thinks that that's what distance learning is. And there have actually been people who have been in this field for a really long time. You could even go back to like correspondence courses happening over letters, right? Like the distance learning's been around for a really long time. In its modern iteration with live video, it's been around for decades. And so it's not what we all experienced, which was like triage. Any given day is like might be my last day during distance learning, so I am not going to invest in actually getting good at this. I'm simply going to survive because my life is also on fire. Like that's what most people's experience was during COVID. And I don't fault teachers for having had that experience, but it is a shame when people generalize the bad experience that many of them had with distance learning to the industry as a whole, because there's a whole lot going on there, a whole lot of opportunity. It's all about access. And in the beginning, it was about access to me, actually. So was teaching in New York City at the time. I taught abroad in Taiwan and really enjoyed being there. The school really liked me. They wanted me to continue teaching, but I had ties back in the US.
Mm-hmm.
So I pitched them this idea to keep teaching for them using live video. At the time, I had to drive from New York City all the way out to Long Island to get access to like the $15,000 box that I was borrowing to be able to make the call, right? Like this is the state of the tech at the
This is how
time.
early it is.
Yeah. And so in the beginning, it was just me, a camera, and 42 fifth graders in Taiwan figuring it out together and basically co-creating a new model of learning. That model of learning wasn't all that different from some things that were going on, but where we really distinguished ourselves is that all the learning was cross-cultural. We were teachers in America who were teaching students in Taiwan, and it was also digital. And so the competencies that we had to teach in order to just be able to get to academic content had to do with cross-cultural competencies, with digital competencies, being able to navigate the online spaces. And so when we decided to branch outside of the clients that we were working with in Asia and start working domestically, it was in those areas that we knew that we had something. Of course, that was about 5 years ago. It was like honestly like the day before the pandemic started. 2 months before the pandemic started, we were like, hey, let's look at the American market and see, like try to work with schools out here. And we took what was the most popular part of our daily distance learning program, which is our live virtual field trips. We had ones that were focused really on global citizenship, And we started selling those via a marketplace called the Center for Interactive Learning and Collaboration, CILC.org. My
Mm-hmm.
co-hosts for the Why Distance Learning podcast are from CILC, and they have all sorts of live virtual field trips. So teachers who are interested in having live virtual experiences in their classrooms, they go to that marketplace and they can find whatever it is that they need to align to their curriculum. And our stuff was all about global citizenship at the time. Of course, then the pandemic happened. I responded to like the needs of my daughter, who was suddenly isolated from her peers, and started running social calls with her and her friends. And that became social calls with her and her class and then her school. And we started teaching SEL skills to students who were stuck at home. This was before SEL was something that was really taught in schools at all. Maybe it was kind of embedded in the process, but it wasn't taught explicitly. And so we had this background of working through some of this stuff with the students in Taiwan as a necessary component to making our program effective. And so we jumped into it. Turns out it was a real natural fit for us, and that extended into digital competencies, which is basically, we see it as like SEL for the internet.
Mm-hmm.
How do kids navigate the modern world, which is full of a bunch of challenges that are unique to their generations. I mean, I say that it's unique to their childhood. We are, as adults, are like struggling through the same things, right? Like, how do
For
we
sure.
manage our screen addiction? How do we know what's real when we're looking on the internet? Some of these like kind of fundamental questions of modern times. And so we developed programs, live virtual programs that go directly into schools that talk about all these things. But what we've arrived at is that like there are some really blurry lines between all of this content. The idea that you have SEL skills that operate in isolation from digital competency skills, which operate in isolation from cross-cultural competency skills, that was the kind of the first approach. But we again realized that like all of these things are super interrelated. So now when we have virtual programs that are focused on global citizenship, we're bringing in digital skills because we're delivering it digitally,
Right.
and we're bringing in SEL skills. And sometimes we don't call it that because of the sort of sensitivities around that word. But the skills that underneath SEL, those were never the problem. Those were never the like political liability, right? It was just the term. So anyway, that's kind of a meandering way of getting to where we got right now, which is that we support schools in these external subject areas that are not reading and math. They're not like the things that a lot of schools are hyper focused on. But any teacher who's looking at their generation of students and realizing that the only certainty about the future is that it is uncertain, and it's growing more and more uncertain all the time, like what do we really need to prepare them with in order to be able to navigate with success? It's not just reading and math. That's the fundamentals. But these other content areas that are kind of brand new, like that's where we thrive.
That's really interesting because um, if you if there's so many things I want to unpack there. The so from an education standpoint, I have said 100 times that as long as kids have basic math in school, basic math and reading, they can do anything. But I agree with what you just said in the same sense because the world we live in, has changed so much that there's skill sets that we don't typically look at, and content, I feel like, is a market that is totally going to blow up over the next couple years, creator driven content, and how to speak to individuals for individual learning and to be able to really dive into that. What were some of the major changes you've seen coming from Asia into the US, and especially having to do that really quick, right? Because you're talking about two totally different user groups.
Yeah. Well, let me say first, there's a reason they call them foundational skills, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to get very far without reading and math. You really do need those things, and even though we don't operate there, we are thankful that people do, so that we can operate where we operate, right? Um, In terms of the difference, I mean, phew, man, there are a ton of cultural differences between the United States and East Asia, where we've been operating, Taiwan and China. I mean, there are a ton of cultural differences just between Taiwan and China, and I would say like the biggest thing, uh, it's cliche, everybody knows it, but it's the collectivist versus individualist
Mm-hmm.
mentality, and the way that that actually plays itself out in an educational setting can be somewhat surprising to people. It can be really difficult to get a classroom full of Asian students to participate at all.
Oh, really?
Whereas especially in like junior high, where they're like hyper peer conscious, it can be really hard to get people to, especially when you're talking about answers that are open ended, right? Where the answer could be anything. It's just about like backing that up. They don't want to like stick out and be the person who said something that was wrong, and so they will just sit there silently, and getting to them to actually participate is an art and a science of like extreme teacher engagement of like how to get the students to be excited enough to forget their fear about being the person who's breaking the collective. Whereas in the
Interesting.
US, it's an individualist society, and you're going to get a lot of kids who are going to be piping up all the time. And it's more like kind of personality based, right? Like there are
Right.
some kids who are going to kind of dominate that conversation. It could be more about like how to get the shy kids to come out. But that's just one example of how those cultural differences of collectivists versus individualists like play themselves out in the classroom. And I would say like, parental involvement's also like a huge difference, and these aren't total monoliths, right? Like there are other factors here, private school versus public school, like socioeconomic factors that are going to determine like what kinds of pressures students are under. But the motivations that any given student has for achieving within school are going to be pretty a lot more individualized in the US than it is going to be in East Asia, where the assumption is just you should be a good student. There's like, I feel like there's a lot of people in the US right now who are sort of questioning the value of certain schooling opportunities,
Mm-hmm.
and that is not really a widespread question at all in East Asia. It is still a place that very much values education, respects teachers. And in those ways, it's kind of refreshing to operate over there because there's not as much of the like sort of political anger towards teachers that we have in the U.S. But there's also a lot more pressures on kids, and it can be hard to really get them to engage for the sake of engagement because they're interested in it as opposed to doing it for external reasons.
That makes sense. And that was actually going to be where I went next. When you look at, there's this big TikTok debate, is should we have TikTok or not? And when you listen to some of the back and forth between it, they'll say that, Asia or China doesn't allow the same content on their TikTok platform as you do in America. And it's a lot more educational. You know, while you were there, did you feel like as a whole, education was always prioritized? I know you touched on it briefly, but how much more? Because you were an educator in New York City as well, right? So to go from one piece of chaos in New York to a country that, isn't your first language, what'd you really see in the difference in prioritizing education? The thing that I wrote down was how much more involved are the parents in education, because I feel like that's a really huge disconnect here. The parents just feel like the teachers should go teach the kids should come home and they should be taught, and the
Yeah.
parents shouldn't have to participate.
Oh man, there's a lot there. So in terms of like general cultural emphasis on education, it is much greater in East Asia than it is in the U.S. And again, it just has it's just sort of an assumption. Like the assumption is you're going to be a good student. You're going to be a good student so that you can grow up, get a good job, and support your family. And that's maybe like one of the underlying factors here is that in Taiwan at least, um, elderly people live with their kids, and the parents go out and they work their asses off,
Mm-hmm.
and the grandparents raise the kids in a lot of cases. Like the nuclear family includes the grandparents. And so the idea that you're investing in your child and their education is like also kind of self-serving, because eventually they're going to be the ones to support you, right? As
Right.
you, because there's not these like, there's not like a lot of retirement homes. Like people live with their kids and they help them raise their grandchildren. Um, in terms of like parental involvement, some of the stuff here is like public school versus private school, where you're just going to have uh, more involved parents who are of like a higher socioeconomic status. And there are a million reasons for that, mostly coming down to the fact that a lot of them don't have to work as much. Like
Right.
it just sort of, kind of starts and ends there. And like anecdotally, the school that I was teaching at in New York City, it was like, how are we going to get the parents to be involved? Right. There's a certain sort of subset of the parents that are naturally involved. The rest of them, like, how am I going to engage with them? I didn't even know at the time that part of that challenge was a cross-cultural challenge, because a lot of the students that I was teaching were not necessarily of a white culture like me. And in Asia, it's like, how are we going to make sure the parents don't take over what's happening here? Right. Like there are lines, clear boundaries that are drawn by the school in terms of how much the parents can be involved. And then there's also an interesting thing that happens where um, the schools are very, very receptive to parent feedback, because part of that collectivist thing, again, is if you don't want to be the one to stick out. So any parent that is complaining, it's because they talk to all the other parents
Mm-hmm.
and they decided collectively that there was an issue. And only then is one parent going to go and talk to the administration of the school. And so there's this sense that, like, if that's happening, it's something that you have to act upon. Whereas, in the US, like every parent has an opinion, right? Like there's probably a whole lot of complaints that go unaddressed.
The
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I could talk for hours about these
No,
cultural
the
differences.
and I'm all about, like I said before we started, I'm all about learning education as a whole, and that's why I do these, is because I never thought I was going to be in education. This is new to me. I've been in with Edsoma for almost 4 years now, and education has become very important part of my journey. But it was never supposed to be. I left school at grade 9. I
Hmm.
had reading issues. I just knew that my kids weren't going to go through the same challenges I did, and this is why I created Edsoma. But
Hmm.
one of the things that we struggle with is parent buy-in. So two things I want to unpack with what you said that I found really interesting is that parents are overly involved and you have to set boundaries on how much they can participate in this learning journey with their kids, which we have the opposite in America. We send our kids to school, and we when they start failing, we complain, but we take no responsibility in what they're not getting at home, for the most part. The other thing that I found interesting is that we are really quick to be verbal about what teachers are doing wrong, although we're not supporting the journey and mission at home. So it just seems like two totally polar opposites.
Yeah, it's not completely polar opposite. There are definitely some similarities, but I think a lot about parent buy-in, and from a business perspective,
Mm-hmm.
it's like it's marketing, right? like
Ooh.
like no matter what you're doing, no matter who you work for, there is a sense that you have to communicate the value of what you're doing in a way that's going to be received and understood by the people that you're trying to communicate that to. And so with parents, like, you got to be able to understand like what their priorities are, what the cultural context is that they're coming from, uh, understand a little bit better what their relationship to schooling was, understand like what the problem is that they're trying to solve by engaging with you, and then be able to like communicate all of that consistently, right? Like it's not just about like getting them to sign up for it. It's about then showing them through whatever reports you're giving the parents, or through assemblies or newsletters, whatever it is, consistently showing them like these things that you care about, these are the things that we are addressing, and here's how we're addressing them, and here are the challenges that we have. And, like involving them in that messaging, but really having like their perspective in mind, I think is a challenge for businesses, let it alone schools, right? Like schools need to be doing this stuff. Like I think about the Common Core math, right?
Mm-hmm.
Common Core math to me is awesome. I love Common Core math because when I learned math, I did all of those strategies without being taught to do those strategies, right? Like that's how I put math in my head. I didn't do like that algorithm where you're borrowing from the tens place to move it over. Like I counted up. That's how I did it when I was doing a subtraction problem in my head. And there is an explicit purpose to Common Core math to make it so that eventually it gets translated into mental math, which is the whole point, because you're not going to have a pen and paper. You're not even going to have the patience to like pull out your cell phone and use the calculator to do a lot of the math that you need to do in everyday life. But where
Right.
there was a fundamental failure on the part of schools everywhere nationwide to communicate that to parents in a way that was going to resonate with them at all. Like we needed to have like a nationwide here's how to do math like campaign, and instead it was just a bunch of stuff went home and parents were like, what is this,
I was
what
that
is this
guy,
crap?
just for the record. I was that guy. Do you know how many times we've like Googled or like YouTubed a video to like, what is this? When did this take place? I was that
Yeah,
guy.
what is this
That
and
was my
why
life.
is this, right? Like they missed the why. Like why are we having them answer it in this way? Why is that answer wrong? Because yes, they got the right answer, but they didn't show their thinking. Why does that matter? And maybe schools did try to do this and parents just didn't show up. But for me, it's about that. It's maybe it's cynical to refer to it as marketing, but it's about marketing, right? Like it's about communicating your value to the stakeholders who matter.
I like how you unpacked all of that with Common Core, the marketing, getting parents in. How do you talk to, in your opinion, and I never told you we were going to get into marketing, but in your opinion, how do you think we could tell that story when it's like, um, we need your input or interaction. I need you to find time in your busy schedule. How do we just get that message out that their involvement is crucial, in these early years of our kids becoming, I just think like when I look back, we always talk to schools and say that you'll find Edsoma in the middle of like learning to read and becoming a love for reading, because that transition is so important to continue absorbing literature, is transitioning from learning to read and really starting to love to read. And
Hmm.
there's a transition that happens there, but without parent support, I think that breakdown for us anyways, there's a breakdown there, and people just do it to get by at some point. But what are some ways that we could really talk to our parents that like, hey, we really do need your help. School's not just for you to send your kids for daycare for 6 to 8 hours. Your participation is needed, because you're selling, a new, I'm going to say new, even though it's, I think you said 18 years old, you started this far, um, a new approach, and it's becoming very popular. Jordan Peterson just launched a university with the same concept of what you've been doing for years.
Huh. I didn't know
So
that. I'll look into that.
yeah, they just like last week.
Huh.
But it just university lectures around university topics.
Interesting.
But
Um,
what you're talking about, I think, is about to get extremely popular, and obviously you've had success with it because you've been doing it for more than a week. So yeah.
yeah, I mean, I'm a member of Vistage. Do you know that?
I
Do
don't.
you know that? So Vistage is it's kind of like a CEO support group, and it's nationwide. There are cohorts that are across the country. Here in Portland, Oregon, it's me and 18 other business leaders, all who are in different industries, and we get together once a month. We do issue processing. We learn from a speaker. When I started this company, I was a public school teacher who started a company. So I I did not, I had no idea how little I knew until I joined Vistage. And then I was like, oh, wow, I knew less than nothing about all of this. And so it's been humbling, and I've learned a lot. One of the things that kind of sticks out to me in your question is this idea of falling in love with their problem, right? So like whatever their problem is, like understanding it back to front, not just understanding that like you can summarize their problem in an elevator pitch and how your product actually addresses it, but like the deep winding road of like what led them to their problem and why it's there, and how your solution like provides an extremely real solution to that problem, and and what the limits of your solution are, so that you don't talk about doing things that you can't do. And that's going to be different for like different market segments. It's going to be different for different stakeholders. You're going to, I mean, ideally, you never stop learning, right? You never stop learning about why this worked for people, what their journey is, from going from a person who's considering engaging with this to someone who engages with this to someone who evangelizes this. Like, what are all those steps along the way? It's going to be specific to your populations. And then it's about like being able to use the words that they use when they describe the impact that your product, your service has had on their lives. And then just figuring out how to, identify where people are in that journey and then get them the right message at the right time. Right.
I
So
love
I don't
that.
have anything specific for you
I
because I
love that.
don't know your market very well,
I
but
had to put it in my phone because my pen just died on me, and um, the what you said resonated so much because when I was pitching our company, people often said, "You don't have education. Why can you change? Why can you fix this?"
hmm,
And because I was the problem, I could speak in it. I could talk to kids that went through it. I could talk to them with the emotions and the fears and anxiety that they're going through because I experienced every aspect of that. And
hmm.
that doesn't go away. So when I built the product, we built the product with those things in mind. And that's why we've had some tremendous success. So I appreciate you saying that. Obviously we've gotten off a little bit of topic, but it's been super helpful. And the other thing that you said, that, not to stay off topic for you, but you went from education to being a business leader. Um, what's that feel like? Because I feel like teachers are going and they're trained to do one thing that's very, I'm gonna use a crappy word, cookie cutter. Here is how you teach a child, or these are the things you do. And building a business, there's no roadmap. There's none. Especially although you're in education, there's so many variables that you're just challenged with every day. What was that process like, going from something very structured? And I say that loosely because teaching today is not very structured. You guys deal with all kinds of personal and chaotic problems, but going in the business direction with that, does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, and I did want to make the point that you just made, which is that like, there are a whole lot of detours off whatever road has been laid out for you, for any given student on any given day.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would say that like my path is somewhat unconventional. When I became when I founded this company, I founded it, as I was telling my story, with a partner in this school that was like my built-in first client, right? And
Okay.
so much of what I did with the company in the first 10 years before we started looking elsewhere to build clientele was simply answer the call of the school. And when I look back at those first 10 years, it was basically like an extension of a school campus. And so not all that much different than working at a school. We were just remote, and there were intercultural issues that we had to solve. There were basic business practices of like hiring and recruitment, training, like things like that. But we weren't operating on an open market. We were operating for a client. We were answering the call to that client, and so in that way, it was a natural evolution, because in the beginning, as I said, it was me, a camera, and 42 fifth graders. I was basically just one teacher of one class. And then we had two classes, and I was a manager of another teacher. And then we started recruiting teachers. And then we started creating curriculum for on-site teachers, not just the distance learning program. So we like developed all these competencies, and each time I was just like, yeah, sure, I can do that. I kind of use this like can-do attitude that I think I've had my whole life. And so that I think the variety of things that were asked of us in those first 10 years go well beyond the scope of a teacher's life.
Mm-hmm.
But it seemed like a very natural progression. It wasn't until we started looking domestically to build the clients outside of the main client where I was like, oh, okay, this is business. And this is hard. Like this, like there is no roadmap, right? And it comes back to, I think a real guiding light for me is product market fit, right? Like there's
Mm-hmm.
got to be a product market fit. You have to understand who your product is. You have to understand who the market is, and you have to understand why the problem that they're having is solved by your product. And that transition was hard. I learned a lot of things the hard way. I pivoted too often. I didn't give anything enough time to work. And again, it was joining Vistage, honestly, that like, and I wonder now if like a lot of the things that I have learned at Vistage, I could have learned in like books or whatever, but it was really helpful to just be able to like go somewhere once a month and learn from them. I will also say like one other uh, major transition for me was the idea of like being a boss. And that's kind of less about business and more just about like working your way up in the world. But in the beginning, I basically wanted to be like Michael Scott from The Office. I was like, hey, I'm everybody's friend, and I'm super cool, and like, we can like have a beer together, and it'll be great. And it took me a while and many like missteps and problems that didn't need to occur for me to realize they don't need a friend, they need a boss. And it wasn't until that moment when I really started to just reflect on like, who am I as a leader, right? Like if I'm not their friend, if this is not just about making them feel good, making them feel comfortable, like what am I providing them? And that's a process of self-reflection that I do all the time. And I find to be really uh, invigorating, to really like hold myself accountable to some values that I'm looking to espouse, to live by, to communicate as like one of the main things that I provide to the company, which is that set of values, that mission, that vision. Yeah, that part's been really hard and really fascinating.
There's a few things there that I'm curious about. You said that it took, about, I think you said 10 years before you started transitioning from your one client to multiple clients. Was that the time frame I think you
Yeah.
gave? So in that 10 years, how many times did you say product market fit in the first 10 years compared
Zero.
to how many times you've said it since then?
Yeah, 5 times a week.
And how important is that in your opinion, when building a
Very.
product? And, you know, this is something that we had a conversation internally about today and yesterday and the day before. And, one, really defining who your client is so you can speak to that client, but really making sure you have product market fit. And for me, not coming from technology, which it sounds like maybe we kind of walked the same path a little bit here, because I didn't understand what product market fit was either. Every time somebody asked me, well, have you found product market fit? I'm like, they're paying us. How much more fit do I need? You know what I mean? Like, that was my mindset behind it, but it's not that at all. It's so much deeper than that, right? And
Mhm.
you can get paid for something and still really not have product market fit. That's one thing. So, um, talk on that transition, and then talk on that transition to really, trying to understand how your products speak to each other or to a new audience.
Yeah, I mean that. I think the challenge is all about getting as much information as you can from the people that you're working with, and for us, like customer success is a way that you could think of that, right? Like, how are you going to, like, yes, you sold the thing, right? Great,
Mm-hmm.
you sold the thing, but how are you going to get people to, how are you going to know whether or not it did what it should have done? How are you going to get people to share that success with other people like them? Because that's what a market is, right? A market is a group of people who refer to each other when making purchasing decisions. So ideally, your product is something that when this problem is shared in the dialogues that occur within the market, that your product's being referred to. But you don't really know that unless you have the information from them. So it's a lot of it's just that hustle of like chasing down the people who've experienced your product and figuring out a way to get them to talk to you. And that's going to be different depending on who those people are,
Right.
where you can find them. Sometimes it might be on social media. It might be like giving them a $10 Starbucks gift card to do a thing. It might be engaging with them at conferences, but it's a hustle, right? And it's probably all of those things and 15 other things.
Right.
But just being able to like understand their journey, the words that they use in order to like get from one step to the other, like that's where you begin to understand, okay, that that thing that they said, that's a promise. Can we fulfill that promise? And if we can, then we've got it.
So I want to point out something, and you've said it now twice, and I think it's super important. Oh, look at those, super important. Um, it was something that I've overlooked a lot of times, but uh, it was surround getting the message out in words that they use. Um, I'll speak from personal experience. It is normal for people in literacy space to go and talk about literacy using the word literacy, right? That makes sense to you. Do you think the people that can't read use the word literacy? How many times do they say, I have a literacy issue?
Oh, wow,
You
the
know,
irony. Yeah.
right. So, it took me, I went to a public speaking class before to learn this. In all the places that I learned it, they're talking to me how to do public speaking because this was something that I struggled with and I really wanted to get better at it. You know, why I do the podcast. But they finally said that. They're like, your message needs to go to the person that you're saying it to, but not in the language that you use every day to explain the problem, but in the way that they would come to you to tell you about the problem that they're having. And
Mm-hmm.
it just totally dawned on me, like how many times I have done this and spoke from something that I was comfortable with, that I understood, trying to sell it to somebody that really needed it. And we couldn't connect because that messaging was wrong. We weren't speaking in the words that they use. I just want to point that out. You've said it twice. It's so important for people to understand
So
that.
important, seems so simple, yet also so difficult.
For sure, for sure. And then the other thing that you said that I will contest to is you want to be everybody's friend while building a business. That's what I thought I wanted to do too. Until they didn't want to do the hard things I needed them to. You know what I mean? So um, my job is to do the hard things that nobody wants to do. And it's not their job to be a friend. And I felt like I had become people's friends within my company early on, to be let down when they wanted to go do something different.
Mm,
You know, you were disappointed, like, why would you want to leave this? We're friends. This is so fun,
mm.
but something ultimately spoke to them that they wanted to chase more importantly. So for me, I didn't want to be let down, but two, it was a lot easier to tell them about the hard things when you weren't friends with them. So I think there's a lot of really good stuff that you dropped in there for new people looking to get into the
Yeah,
business
and
world.
to riff on that a little bit, one of the managerial kind of I don't know, changes of perspective that I had was that it's really wonderful if people can leave your company and then go work somewhere that they really want to work and
Mhm.
succeed there.
I
because
agree with
that
that.
shows that the experience that they had at your company prepared them for that other experience. I love to think of like the Banyan diaspora, right? Like the people who've come through our virtual hallways and are now succeeding at various walks of life, mostly still within education. It really, first of all, it brings me joy and pride to know that I played a part in their journey. Uh, but it also allows me to think differently about losing people. Because ultimately, like, you're not going to be, you're probably not going to be anybody's forever job. That's just sort of not how jobs work anymore.
Right.
Right. And so if you start from there, if you assume that at some point people are going to leave, why wouldn't you want to prepare them to be as attractive a candidate as possible through the experience of success that they've had at your company? Like and that changes, that perspective can be a lens through which you see a ton of the organizational decisions that you make.
No, that's really good. And the other thing that I want to add to that, that somebody just recently, like literally in the last week, said to me, because we were doing some changes, uh, and they're like, why would you want people to be here forever?
Hmm.
And it really started making me think, like when I thought back to my parents or my grandparents, they went to work and they had the same job for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years.
Yeah.
I felt like that said something about the company, and about loyalty. And loyalty is also important to me. But what they said is that, when you surround yourself with people for 20 years that never change, how much opportunity to grow did you really get?
Hmm.
And that kind of struck me from a different angle that I never thought about it from. So it was really interesting to be able to step back and think about that. Like, people are leaving because they want to, go out and re-challenge themselves or, grow themselves in a different area. But as a business owner, those are opportunities for you to grow as well by bringing new talent to the table. Uh,
Yeah.
to,
Yeah,
to
absolutely. It makes me think about like a personnel shift that I made in the last like 3 years. This person that was a core team member, and I made a move in a different direction with a different person, and what I realized was I had built up my core team in my own image. That like it was a bunch of people who were really good at the same things that I was good at, and that was
Mhm.
great when we were all in the trenches together. These people that helped me build the company, that's exactly what I needed at that time. People who could wear like 17 different hats. But we had gotten to the point where we needed people who could specialize. And so bringing on some people who had skills that were way different from mine, that has been like kind of a cultural sea change, to be able to do some different things, accomplish some different things because we have that diversity of thought. There's new blood
That's
in
really
there.
good too. People do need to really think about what you just said there. Well, Seth, I had 100 other questions that I didn't get to go through.
That's how you know it was a good episode.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this. There's a lot of things that I got to learn, but I do ask the last question every time, because I can't say this enough. I wish I would have invested into it earlier. How important has your network been in growing and building your business, and what's gotten you to where you're at today? How important has that been for you?
I mean, critically important in that the whole reason I taught abroad in Taiwan in the first place was through a personal connection. I was introduced to that school through a friend. So there's there's just that reality of it. I would have gone a different path. I don't know what path that would have been. I had a different business, a tutoring business at the time that I was building up in New York City. Maybe that would have been the thing. I don't know. Um, what I can say is, first of all, I really love networking just for the purpose of meeting people. I love hearing people's stories. It's what I love about podcasting. I have two podcasts. Why Distance Learning is one of them. The other one's called Make It Mindful, and takes kind of a broader look at education and kind of looks at people who are doing amazing things and kind of whittles it down to like what do they do, why does it work, and how can we apply that to the classroom in a practical and transformative kind of way. I love having those conversations. So I actually have two podcasts. One of them is called Why Distance Learning, which I mentioned before. The other one's called Make It Mindful. It's about like taking a mindfulness lens and applying it to education, and being a little bit more objective, trying to see what's really going on here, interviewing change makers, trying to figure out like what they do, why it works, and how we can translate it into like practical transformative solutions for teaching. And I love having those conversations. And I've found more often than not that because you've had this conversation with someone and there's now this relic of it that's on the internet, it is a deeper kind of relationship. Like if I had a meeting with you, Kyle, and you and I had just like talked for half an hour about our businesses, that
Mhm.
might have gone somewhere. But now the internet knows that we sat and we talked, right?
Right.
And it feels like, I have a deeper insight into Edsoma because I prepared for this, right? And it was more of it was like a deeper connection, and networking is the type of thing where like you have no idea where any given thing is going to go, any given meeting. I'll give an example. Is that I mentioned CILC. It's
Mhm.
this marketplace we've been working with for the past 5 years. The co-hosts of my Why Distance Learning podcast are people who work at CILC. I went and saw them in person at last year's ISTE conference. And it was the first time that we had met each other in person. So it was the first time we'd shared a meal together. And we sat down and we started just kind of buzzing around what we do and how we could potentially work together in ways that go beyond what we're currently doing. And we just today answered a grant that is like a, Department of Commerce grant for like a large sum of money that we could do a lot of great things with. We'll see if we get it or not. But the point being, that is something I did not see coming, right? Like
Right.
I was 35 episodes deep into this podcast before I was like, oh, wait a minute. Maybe we could do more together. And so, I say that just to illustrate that you don't know where any of these conversations can go. I need to like limit myself in my networking. I had to like my Make It Mindful podcast is released every 2 weeks. Over the summer, I had to release it every week because I just had to like get the like backlog out,
I understand.
because I love doing it and I love meeting people, and I just believe in the potential of any given connection. And I think that is really spoken to in the work that we do as well. We're teaching people how to connect digitally, how to connect cross culturally. These types of connections have the potential to have an even greater impact than the type of connection you might get if you meet someone within your own geographic space. And it speaks to the human experience, and what is like fundamental about us as a cooperative species, that we form networks, and that those networks, have utility in whatever context we might need them to. We just have to be curious, we have to be humble, and we have to pay attention. And if we can do those things, then good things will happen.
I love that. And one of the things that, and I've got a whole team, so I'm super lucky. Anne produces these and does all the editing, but Lindell, who you've probably spoke to, does all the research on them, and she'll bring a group of people like, hey, these are the people that I think we could really learn from. Who should I reach out to and talk to? And I'm fortunate in that, but a lot of times she'll go and do all this research and give me all these questions. And if there has been, if you said it earlier, that's how you can tell if it's a good question or a good podcast. If I'm constantly asking questions off the page, I didn't get a lot from that. If
Yeah,
I can sit down and have that conversation one on one and just be lost, and quite often I stare at the ceiling to try and collect my thoughts while I'm doing this, but um, those are the ones that I really love and sit back and I'm like, oh my God, I thank so much that I've got to have these conversations. I've got to speak with people that dance with robots, and from a ballet perspective. And she's a doctor. And there was a lady that was building an ed tech company, and her go to market strategy was having journalists try her products. So once she was ready to launch it, that the journalists would do the marketing for her for free because they had done all the testing. And there's just so many different amazing ideas that I've got to learn from these really creative people that come to the ed tech space because they really want to make an impact in somebody else's lives. So they look at it through a different lens. And the nice part about it, you've got to be on both sides of it, the education side of it and the advancement start from a technology, company coming in and providing to educators. But it's just so nice to talk to people that love making that difference. and have taken a step back to really look at it from a different angle and learn from that, because as soon as we stop learning, the world stops growing. So
Hmm.
that's why I have so much fun doing this. And I'm super blessed to have you on the show. Uh, Seth, I'd love to have another conversation so we can maybe get to some of these questions, but I try and keep these short enough for everybody to get to the end, and we're already at 50 minutes. So
Yeah, Kyle, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity. I'd love to talk more. We don't have to record it. It'd be great to like get to know your business a little bit more, and maybe I can turn the tables, ask you some questions.
for sure. And Seth, if somebody wanted to find you, find out more about what what you're doing, how to get involved in it, how do they find you?
Yeah. So first of all, there's if you're listening to this podcast, you like podcasts, check out my podcast. One
Yeah,
of them is called
we'll
Why
share the
Distance
link.
Learning question mark and Make It Mindful is the other one. Banyan Global.
I think anybody that likes this podcast without even have watched the other two, I guarantee Make It Mindful is something that our
Yeah.
audience will really fall in love with, because I think we are very aligned with why we're doing these things. So I think that anybody listening to this, definitely check out both of them, but I bet you would love
Awesome. Yeah. And then banyangloballearning.com is our website, BANYAN globallearning.com. Check me out on LinkedIn. I'm happy to connect there.
and we will make sure to put all those links in the description on this. And then, yeah, I appreciate it so much. Have an amazing weekend, and love to see where this goes.
Awesome. Thanks, Cal. Talk soon.
Talk soon.